This morning, as we get into our message, I have a question for you. How many of you this week maybe saw the news article headline on TV, social media, about a 2-year-old girl who became the youngest American to be a part of American Mensa, the high IQ society? How many people saw that article? All right, well, I got her picture up here. This 2-year-old's name is Cash Quest. Cash is 2, lives in California, and she did her IQ test, and her IQ score was 146. I had to look it up. The average IQ for Americans is about 98. So she scored 146. This is a smart little girl. In fact, she, at 2, is able to identify all the elements of the periodic table, can identify all the 50 states based on their size and shape, can decipher pretty advanced patterns, is learning Spanish, which is not her first language, and is also learning American Sign Language. And according to her parents, she can count all the way to 100. Which, after hearing this, all I have to say to Cash Quest is 101. 102, 103. But Cash Quest is very, very smart. But as smart as this 2-year-old is, if you go on a search engine like Google and you type in wisest person in the world, or who was the wisest person in the world, she doesn't pop up. She's not even in the top 100. But who do you think is usually the number 1 person that comes up? King Solomon. King Solomon, the same King Solomon that we're reading about today. He is known for his wisdom, being very, very wise. He was known during his lifetime, and even now, thousands of years later, he is still known as wise King Solomon. Well, where did his wisdom come from? Well, if we go back into 1 Kings chapter 3, when Solomon becomes king, after David dies, God appears to Solomon in a dream. And let's take a look at what he asked Solomon. It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. So what does Solomon ask for? Does he ask for riches? Does he ask for strength, physical strength? Does he ask for an extended car warranty? No. What does he ask for? He asks for wisdom. And we see this. We go to the next section. This is what he says. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and distinguish between right and wrong, for who is able to govern this great people of yours? Well, how would you translate that? Wisdom. He's asking for wisdom to discern, to understand right from wrong. He's asking for wisdom, and God grants him wisdom. And because God so likes Solomon's answer, his request, he also says, and you will also have great riches. And we know that Solomon was a rich, rich king. We talked about last week the temple that some people believe to this day, that temple that he built for God could have been worth as much as $1 trillion. Which in the ancient world, that's saying something. But he had great, great wealth. But before that wealth was his wisdom. And there's several stories, perhaps you've heard them in Scripture, about his wisdom. There's one where, as a king, Solomon is there making a decision about these 2 women. See, these 2 women are both claiming to be the mother of a baby. Now, they're actually 2 prostitutes, and one says that it's hers, and the other says, no, it's mine. And it's clear that one of them is lying, but neither one will admit it. And so what does King Solomon do? Maybe you know the story. He asks for a sword. And he tells his guard, chop the baby in half and give half the baby to each lady. Which one of the women says, no, give the child to the other, let him survive. While the other woman says, fine, go ahead. Then neither of us can have the child. Well, of course, Solomon, in that decision, quickly figures out that the mother is the one who just wants to give the child because she doesn't want the child hurt. The story is famous throughout the world, but after that, a lesser known fact, no one ever brought their babies to King Solomon again. So that's one piece of wisdom. Then there's another story later, just right before this passage, where another ruler, the Queen of Sheba, and biblical historians are not 100% sure where Sheba was. Some say it was in Yemen, modern day Yemen. Others say Ethiopia. But the Queen of Sheba traveled a long distance. And why did she travel a long distance? Because she heard about Solomon's wisdom. And the Queen of Sheba was also known to be very, very wise. And so she goes to Solomon and she sets up a series of tests. And you can read about this in 1 Kings chapter 10. And she asks him probably riddles, quizzes. Maybe she gives him a Where's Waldo book and finds out how long it takes him to find Waldo. Whatever it is, she didn't really do the Waldo thing. That's a joke. All right. But whatever it is, Solomon passes all these tests easily. And the queen is impressed. She's impressed with his palace, with all his workers. But what is she most impressed with? His wisdom. His wisdom. And so, here he is, wise King Solomon. But the scripture reading we just read from chapter 11, 1 Kings 11, paints a different picture of Solomon and all his wisdom. You see, as wise as Solomon is and was, we see Solomon make some pretty big mistakes. And it all begins with that first verse of chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Let's stop there for a second. There is a lot packed into verse 1. A key word that I want you, if you take notes or just make a mental note, to make a note of is the third word of verse 1. What's that word? However. Well, what is the word however? It is an interruption. Right? Anytime, not just in the Bible, but in literature, when we see however, we usually know something is about to change, right? For example, maybe something like this. He was a quiet office worker. However, on Friday nights, he became a vampire. Oh, right? There's a drastic change. All right, how about this? She was a smart and shy chemistry student. However, she was building a nuclear warhead in her basement. That one little word, all of a sudden, we go, oh, hold on. We see a however. We know we're about to probably do a 180. Things are going to drastically change. It is exactly the same in this verse. It starts, King Solomon, and you can probably, oh, King Solomon the wise, King Solomon the rich, King Solomon the powerful, King Solomon the wonderful. However, and you go, oh, what's about to happen to Solomon? And look what it follows with. The next few words are going to show us the however. What's going to happen to Solomon that's going to change the way we view him? And what's the next words after the however? Loved many foreign women. Now let's dissect that little beauty for a second. Do you see a problem with those four words? Loved many foreign, and then what's the last one? Women. It's a plural. This isn't good. It should be loved a woman, right? He loved many women. Now, then we add an adjective between the many and women, and what's that word? Foreign. Foreign women. And then we go on and we find out, well, his first wife was Pharaoh's daughter. And then there's a whole list. And remember, they give us this list to show us the many what women that he loved? Foreign. We've got the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Sidonians, and the Hittites. Solomon loved a lot of foreign ladies, didn't he? And we think, well, that's okay. No, it's not okay, because go back. Here's the thing. He had many, many wives. And we go, oh, that's what they did in the ancient world. Well, let me back it up for a second, because sometimes there's some pretty fundamental misunderstandings when it comes to marriage in the scripture. And if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, you're going to see God speaking to Moses. Remember Moses way back in Exodus, right? When he leads the people out. Then we have the book of Deuteronomy. You're going to see God telling Moses some commands for the people to live with. And he gives them some commands about kings. And look what he says. He's talking about the kings. He, the king, must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Both King David, Solomon's father, and Solomon failed this one both ways, right? They both had many wives and both accumulated a lot of wealth. God was not in favor of the multiple marriage system. He was not a fan of polygamy. So Solomon already is falling astray from what God has commanded. Now, why foreign women? What's the problem with that? Well, if we go to verse 2 of 1 Kings 11, you'll see they give us a warning of why God says this. It's not that God's anti-foreign ladies, but it's what it can lead to. Because look at verse 2. They were from nations from which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. That's exactly what Deuteronomy 17:17 was warning about. You will be led astray. Now the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, these people were all in the land of Canaan, surrounding Israel. And God had told them since the day they got into the promised land with Joshua, that he told them, do not intermarry. And it's not because God hated these other people, it's because he understood what would happen to the faith of the people of Israel. And unfortunately, this is exactly what happens to Solomon. He marries all these foreign wives, and eventually, what happens? He begins to worship their gods. Exactly what God warned him against. Now, how many wives did Solomon marry? Look at verse 3. How many ladies did he marry? 700. Then he had 300 concubines. These are royal concubines. 700 plus 300. Do you think he even knew all their names? I'm not so sure. Now just think about that. God says, don't marry a bunch of wives, kings of Israel. And Solomon says, you know what? 700 should be a good number. Now, I have read multiple commentaries that talk about that Solomon probably had so many wives because he was making political alliances with other kingdoms. And that's very possible. But from the indication that we get from this reading, talking about how he loved many foreign women, I don't think the political alliance was the first reason that he got all these wives. I think Solomon was consumed with lust, but also pride. He liked having a very big, very expensive palace. He liked it that he built a very expensive temple. He liked all his wealth. And I think when he saw his 700 wives and 300 concubines, that was kind of a trophy in his prideful heart. You know, some kings have a few wives. I've got a castle full. So political alliances definitely could have been at play, but I think ultimately Solomon was consumed with this lust and this pride for what he had. And like we said, what happens? Because he doesn't follow God's ways, he begins to turn his heart turn his heart away from God, right? In verse 4, he turns his heart away and he turns his heart to other gods. He turns his heart to other gods. And this is the beginning of Solomon's absolute downfall. And we see because he's not obeying God, he's so consumed with his own pride. What is God telling him by the end of this section that we read today? That your kingdom's going to be ripped apart. I'm going to let you stay, King Solomon, but when your son, whose name was Rehoboam, when he becomes king, it's going to be torn in two. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. When Rehoboam becomes king, Israel becomes divided. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And as you saw in the verse, the southern kingdom is one tribe, the tribe of Judah, and the rest form their own kingdom. And never again after this will Israel be united under one king of their own. It all falls apart. And why does it all fall apart? Because Solomon was consumed with his own pride and lust. Now, here's the thing. The question we have to ask of this text, the question we have to ask of history is, if Solomon was so wise, what happened to him? Right? How could someone so wise do something so dumb? And I would argue with you that even though you Google and you put in who is the wisest person who ever lived and King Solomon pops up, I would also argue that Solomon was the biggest idiot who ever lived. And you know why? Because, just do a little math. If you have 700 wives, do you know what else you have? 700 mothers-in-law. Yeah. Now, I've got one mother-in-law, Karen. She's probably online right now. Love you, Karen. All right. I think that's all great. But do you know what you call 700 mothers-in-law for one person? That's hell. That is the description of hell. I am pretty sure if you looked it up, you find the little asterisks, that would be hell, right? Now, besides his plague of mothers-in-laws, and I know all of you who are mother-in-laws, oh, that's not me. Of course it's not you. But if you multiplied you 700 times, just think about it. All right, now, besides that, Solomon's biggest problem was not his wisdom, but it was his lack of focus. He had all the knowledge up here, but his focus here was terrible. We could say he basically had unfocused wisdom. He did not focus on God. No, his focus was on himself. He became rather drunk in his own wisdom. His focus was on all the stuff he accumulated. His focus was on his power, how wonderful he was. It wasn't on who put him where he is, who gave him that wisdom. He lost his focus. In fact, there's several other books that are possibly attributed to Solomon writing. Perhaps you've heard of Proverbs. Scholars believe that he wrote many of the Proverbs. But he also wrote a book called Ecclesiastes, or at least we think he wrote it. And the main character, whether he wrote it or not, is referred to as King Solomon. And if you go to Ecclesiastes, and if Solomon wrote it, he probably wrote it later in life. If you go to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 11, let's take a look at that. Look at what he says. Now, just put this in perspective. This possibly is Solomon in the later part of his life, reflecting over all his experiences, reflecting of that castle full of wives, reflecting of all his wealth, all his power, all his authority. And what does he say? Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was what? Meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. If you read Ecclesiastes, that word meaningless is there over and over again. And if that is Solomon writing it, just think about that. There he is in the last few years of his life, and he sees all these accomplishments, all this stuff, and what does he say? It's meaningless. And why does he say that? Because Solomon is faced with the harsh reality that as wise as he was, he lost his focus on God. And all that stuff, all the gold, all the accomplishments, all the statues that were put up all over the land of him was meaningless because he knew he had failed to focus on God. Now, I don't know about you, but I read this story of King Solomon and his fall and these bad choices and this lack of focus, and I feel a little nervous because I'm no King Solomon. I'm not even Cash Quest, the 2-year-old, right? I've never become American Mensa member, right? I haven't taken an IQ test because I don't want to know, right? In fact, just for fun, I decided to Google who is the wisest pastor. I didn't even make the top 1,000. In fact, you know who the number one hit was? A guy named Steve Wise. I thought, that's not fair. That's his last name. And so I said, you know what? We should specify because that's too broad. So I Googled, this is the true story. I Googled wisest pastor at Beyond the Walls Community Church. I came up number 3. Turns out there's a couple other Beyond the Walls community churches out there, and evidently their pastors are smarter. So according to a worldwide search engine, I can't even make top number 1 in my own church. So what hope do I have? If Solomon screwed it up so badly, what hope do I have to focus on God and not go astray? Well, here's the good news for me and for you. That there was another wise man who came after Solomon. You see, there was another wise man who was even wiser than King Solomon. His name was Jesus. In fact, if we go back and we look in the Gospels, you'll notice in the Gospel of Mark, it talks about Jesus when he begins his ministry. He begins preaching and teaching and performing miracles. And what do the people say about him? Now remember, when he began his ministry, the people knew Jesus and his family. He began his ministry right there around the Sea of Galilee, around Nazareth, where he grew up. And what do they say? Take a look. Now, this is what they're saying. This is word on the street about Jesus. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things? They asked. What's this what? Wisdom that has been given him. What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? They are recognizing Jesus is wise. He has great wisdom. Great wisdom. But Jesus even takes it a step further. If we go to the Gospel of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 12, Jesus talks about himself. And look who he compares himself to. Go ahead and go to Matthew chapter 12, 42. The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. Wait, hold on. The queen of the south, what's he referring to? The queen of Sheba. Sheba's from the south. The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. Solomon, the same one we're talking about. And now something greater than Solomon is here. Do you hear what Jesus is saying? As wise as Solomon was, I'm greater. And Jesus isn't bragging, he's stating a fact. Because Jesus is the wisest. Remember, when he was born, who came to see him? Wise men, right? They came to see. Now just think about that. These brilliant astrologers, right? A lot of times wise men were counsels to the kings. They come from the east, come from Persia probably. And what are they doing? They're coming to give honor to a baby, right? Possibly a 1 or 2-year-old. Now just think about that. These wise people are bowing down at the feet of this little child because they're recognizing there's someone wiser than us here on this earth. And Jesus is that wise. You see, Jesus is what Solomon could never be. Jesus had all power and authority as the Son of God. He also had all the riches of both the earth and heaven, far richer than Solomon could ever be. He had all the wisdom of being God. But Jesus also had something Solomon lacked so significantly. He had focus. Jesus knew exactly what he had come on earth to do. And what was that? What was his mission? It was to go and die on a cross to save all people from their sin. That was his mission. It had been his mission since the very beginning of time. It was the plan. And he focused on it. He never, ever took his eyes off that goal. He was willing to die, to be tortured, to be beaten, because he refused to lose focus. And why did he refuse to lose focus? Because he loved you. He loves you. With all that wisdom, Jesus also had amazing focus. Amazing focus. And so, for the guy who was the third wisest pastor at Beyond the Walls Community Church, I'm not looking to King Solomon to find inspiration and encouragement. I'm looking to the one who died on a cross. I'm looking to the one who gave his life. Because, friends, there is nothing wrong with wisdom. This isn't an anti-wisdom message. Increase your wisdom, absolutely, but never lose your focus. Gain wisdom, learn, gain knowledge, but don't lose your focus. And I'm going to tell you something that really, really bothers me. And that's, you can see multiple examples of this. As people develop head knowledge, and even people who sometimes develop head knowledge about the Bible and Bible history and ancient languages, as head knowledge increases, sometimes it becomes a temptation to lose our focus. Because we start to think, wow, I sure know a lot of stuff. I am really, really smart. And there's nothing wrong with being confident. But understand this. Don't let this become so big that this forgets where you came from and who loves you. Don't lose focus. Increase your knowledge, absolutely. Especially increase your biblical knowledge. Get into the Bible. But don't lose focus on the one who died on a cross for you, the one who loves you. You know, I once heard that it's important for us to learn from the mistakes of those who come before us. Why? Because we don't live long enough to make all the mistakes in the world. We can learn from Solomon's mistakes. And yeah, guys, don't have 700 wives. I'm going to just throw that out there. I know, some of you scratch that off your list. But here's what's most important. Keep your heart focused on God. Keep your heart focused on God. You don't have to be the wisest person in the room. You don't have to pretend that you know everything. You don't even have to pretend that everything in your life is going great. It's okay to be honest with God. But don't lose focus. That focus on God, that's what's most important. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. That's what we say at the beginning of service every Sunday. Lay your burdens at the cross. In fact, maybe those burdens, sometimes they're just right there in front of your eyes, and they're causing you to look this way and that way. And God's saying, no, put them here. Give them to my son and focus on him. Focus on him. He loves you. He's always loved you. And he's with you. He's not going anywhere. He's with you. You are his. So, you know what? I'm okay that I'm not a member of Mensa. In fact, the only card I'll ever get that comes close to being a member of Mensa, maybe I'll become a member of Men's Warehouse. But here's the thing. I can make the wisest choice. And so can you. And that choice is simply, I'm going to focus my life on Jesus. I'm going to let him guide me. I'm going to let him carry the load. And no matter what you're going through, whether you're in a high right now, you're in a low, or you're somewhere in between, let's focus on that cross. Let's focus on our Savior.